The intruder moved with absolute and chilling precision through the quiet property wearing head-to-toe black clothing that blended perfectly into the dark of the desert night. However, they forgot one inescapable and permanent truth of our modern existence. The suspect had achieved a terrifying level of insulation without ever needing to communicate. They had simply stepped back into the shadows and let human nature run its toxic course. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario for any investigator to face. You have endless data but no direction, and a suspect who understands exactly how to exploit the modern media landscape. But this paralyzing frustration was about to be absolutely obliterated by a groundbreaking realization regarding the unseen environment. Have you ever considered how easily someone could impersonate your worst nightmare just by scrolling through your social media feeds? Tell us in the comments what hidden detail you think the authorities are overlooking, because the next phase of this manhunt will permanently redefine modern criminal investigations. The entire trajectory of the manhunt violently shifted when federal behavioral analysts and cyber specialists re-examined the very concept of the crime scene. They realized that the physical perfection of the abduction was a massive distraction, and the real battleground was floating invisibly in the air around the property. The tactical intruder had meticulously prepared to defeat human vision and biological forensics, but they completely underestimated the silent, automated witnesses surrounding them. You might be able to scrub your physical presence from a living room, but no one can ever truly turn invisible in the vast, interconnected digital world. Every modern neighborhood is essentially blanketed in an invisible web of radio frequencies, constantly searching for connections. When the suspect approached the residence, they likely believed that switching their mobile device to airplane mode or turning it off entirely would render them completely untraceable. This is a common and fatal misconception, often popularized by television shows. In reality, that deliberate disruption of service creates a highly suspicious data gap, a literal black hole in the cellular network that can be tracked just like a physical footprint. Law enforcement began analyzing the massive volumes of regional cell tower data, looking for anomalies that matched the exact time frame of the abduction. But the truly revolutionary breakthrough involved a much more intimate layer of technology. Even when a smartphone is not actively connected to the internet, it is relentlessly broadcasting its unique media access control address, searching for familiar network. This is a hardwired identifier specific to that exact piece of hardware. As the shadowy figure moved through the quiet suburban streets, their concealed device was allegedly pinging every single nearby router it passed. The trail they left behind was entirely unseen to the naked eye, but it was already painting a chillingly clear picture for specialized investigators. These routers, functioning as silent digital sentinels, diligently logged those invisible handshakes. The suspect might have worn thick gloves to prevent leaving fingerprints on the door handles, but they unknowingly smeared their unique digital signature across the wireless networks of multiple surrounding households. This process of digital triangulation allowed investigators to reconstruct the exact path of the phantom without ever needing a physical footprint. Furthermore, the seemingly useless security footage from the front porch held a massive hidden clue that had initially been overlooked. While the masked figure was the obvious focal point, specialized analysts focused entirely on the dark background. A distant camera mounted at an active commercial construction site located just down the street was inadvertently recording the subtle ambient light changes in the surrounding environment. by precisely synchronizing the microscopic reflections of headlights caught on the porch camera with the vast data logs from the construction site surveillance. The authorities were able to establish a flawless and undeniable timeline of the suspect's arrival and departure. The phantom, who had dressed entirely in black to blend into the night, had been completely illuminated by the invisible spectrum of metropolitan data collection. Subscribe to Ellis Case Reports right now as we track every single digital footprint in this unprecedented modern manhunt. Their absolute arrogance in the physical realm was perfectly matched by their profound ignorance in the digital domain. They had constructed an elaborate physical disguise while unknowingly carrying a brilliantly glowing digital beacon right in their pocket. This was an unprecedented moment of clarity for the investigative team. The extortion letters and the opportunistic scammers were finally pushed aside as the unalterable mathematics of the wireless signals pointed directly toward a viable and terrifying suspect. This revelation completely changes how we understand modern predators because it proves that no amount of physical preparation can defeat the passive surveillance of our interconnected lives. The authorities were no longer searching for a man in a mask, they were hunting a specific piece of broadcasting silicon. This digital dragnet required an astonishing level of computational power to process, but the results were mathematically irrefutable. Every router, every tower, and every surveillance lens had combined to form a net that the suspect never saw coming. The sheer brilliance of this forensic approach demonstrates a monumental shift in how federal agencies investigate high-stakes kidnappings. The implications of this technology are absolutely staggering. It means that the traditional concept of an alibi is now entirely dependent on corroborating data. Living completely alone at 84 years of age in the affluent and secluded Catalina foothills of Arizona, you cannot simply claim you were not at the scene if your device was actively communicating with the local hardware. The suspect had spent countless hours planning the perfect physical crime, studying the layout of the neighborhood, and memorizing the victim's routines. They anticipated the dogs, the alarms, and the deadbolts, but they failed to comprehend the silent language spoken between machines. This invisible conversation happening at the speed of light completely dismantled their meticulous master plan. The Phantom was finally cornered not by a SWAT team kicking down a door, but by a server quietly processing a log file. Have you ever thought about what your own wireless router is secretly recording right now while you are safely asleep in your bed? Through the painstaking months of March and April 2026, the Federal Task Force transitioned from a frantic physical search into an exhausted but highly focused data processing operation. Teams of elite cyber analysts were sequestered in secure facilities, relentlessly filtering through literal terabytes of complex location data. They were essentially panning for digital gold, sifting through the innocent electronic movements of thousands of local residents to isolate the single malicious anomaly that represented the kidnapper. Nancy was remarkably independent, perfectly lucid, and fully capable of managing her quiet daily routine. This grueling process required writing custom algorithms specifically designed to cross-reference the regional cell tower blackouts with the hyperlocal router handshakes discovered at the scene. Slowly but surely, the vast, intimidating map of the American Southwest began to aggressively shrink. The invisible web that the suspect had unknowingly triggered was now pulling tight, rapidly closing the geographic radius of their potential hiding spots. Investigators could now confidently trace the invisible breadcrumbs leading away from the remote desert neighborhood, tracking the silent pings as the vehicle moved across different municipal jurisdictions. The suspect had trapped themselves within a cage of their own making, believing they were a master of evasion, while systematically mapping their own escape route for the authorities. The sheer volume of undeniable electronic evidence being compiled was rapidly building an airtight legal foundation that would eventually guarantee a conviction. The digital footprint had fundamentally resurrected a case that was on the brink of being completely consumed by the chaotic noise of opportunistic extortionists. Yet despite this monumental technological triumph, a heavy and suffocating atmosphere of dread continued to hang over the command center. They had successfully identified the invisible path the predator had taken, but the most critical and agonizing question remained entirely unanswered. Where was the victim right now? She remained deeply connected to her local community through regular online interactions, maintaining a vibrant social life despite her physical isolation. The data could reveal the historical movements of a piece of hardware, but it could not provide a live heartbeat or confirm the physical condition of the elderly captive. The terrifying reality that she required constant medical intervention meant that every passing day diminished the mathematical probability of a successful rescue. The authorities had cracked the digital code, but they were still trapped in a merciless race against human biology. The investigators were forced to confront the haunting possibility that they might finally catch the phantom, only to discover that they were already far too late to save the life they had sworn to protect. The digital trail was hot, but the physical trail was still horrifyingly cold. This agonizing paradox defines the modern era of law enforcement, where investigators can know exactly how a crime was committed without knowing the final outcome of the tragedy. The tension in the task force room was palpable as they prepared to execute the final tactical maneuvers based on the data they had uncovered. They were no longer guessing, they were moving with absolute mathematical certainty. But certainty does not always guarantee survival. Yet this very modern and heavily connected lifestyle exposed a terrifying transparency that most people simply accept without realizing the severe danger it poses. The family, who had endured months of public scrutiny, false hope, and cruel extortion attempts, was now forced into a state of suspended animation. They were fully aware that the authorities were closing in, but the lack of physical confirmation was a unique kind of psychological torture. They had to trust in the invisible evidence, hoping that the algorithms and data points would eventually lead to a physical reunion. The entire community watched with bated breath as the massive federal apparatus silently shifted its weight, preparing to strike. The suspect, completely unaware that their invisible shield had been thoroughly shattered, continued to operate under the delusion of total control. They had no idea that a highly specialized team was currently mapping their every historical movement, preparing to rip them from the shadows. The confrontation was inevitable, but the ultimate human cost of this elaborate game of cat and mouse was still terrifyingly uncertain. The digital net was perfectly constructed, but would it pull up a survivor or merely a tragic resolution? What this case teaches us about the illusion of privacy is profoundly disturbing and forces a complete reevaluation of our modern security landscape. From an analytical perspective, we must understand that the principles of open source intelligence are no longer exclusive to government agencies or elite hackers. In our highly networked society, personal information is no longer a private sanctuary guarded by physical walls. Anyone with malicious intent can easily harvest your daily routines, your familial connections, and your precise location simply by scraping the public data you unknowingly provide. This investigation highlights a terrifying vulnerability, demonstrating how easily opportunistic predators can weaponize this freely available information to construct devastating secondary crimes like extortion. Furthermore, the forensic evidence gathered here provides a crucial lesson in the mechanics of modern digital behavior. Your personal devices are fundamentally designed to seek connection, constantly initiating microscopic handshakes with any available infrastructure. Even when you intentionally disable your active internet connection, your phone is still actively screaming its unique identity into the void, hoping a nearby router will answer. This relentless automated broadcasting creates a permanent and unalterable geographic history. We are witnessing a monumental paradigm shift in criminal justice, moving rapidly from the traditional pursuit of physical blood drops to the highly sophisticated analysis of invisible data drops. The concept of being entirely off the grid is now a complete myth, an outdated fantasy that no longer exists in reality. Every step you take in a populated area is meticulously recorded, categorized, and stored by a network of machines you never explicitly agreed to interact with. Her home addressed the direct cell phone numbers of her daughters and the exact layout of her. This case forces us to critically analyze the profound behavioral consequences of existing within a system where absolute anonymity is mathematically impossible. We must adapt our understanding of personal safety to include this constant digital surveillance, recognizing that our devices are always watching. The chilling reality of this investigation is that the physical crime scene has been permanently replaced by an invisible and omnipresent data grid. The tactical perfection of the intruder was ultimately dismantled by the very technology they thought they could easily outsmart. The authorities successfully tracked a ghost through a maze of wireless signals, turning routers and construction cameras into their most reliable witnesses. But as the digital net finally closes around the suspect, the haunting question still remains. Will this unprecedented technological footprint be enough to bring an innocent woman home before her time completely runs out? The true terror lies in the silence between the data points and the agonizing wait for a physical resolution. And while this phantom failed to erase their wireless signature, it forces us to wonder what happens when the predator actually understands the technology better than the investigators. What happens when the data itself is entirely fabricated to frame an innocent person? A thick ski mask completely obscured any identifying facial features, while heavy tactical gloves ensured secluded neighborhood were all sitting wide open on various public open source data platforms. Click the video on your screen right now to join us as we analyze a terrifying case where a brilliant killer successfully manipulated satellite tracking and completely rewrote their own global positioning data. You definitely do not want to miss how they pulled it off. Anyone with a basic internet connection and malicious intent could trace the exact location of this vulnerable elderly woman without ever setting foot in Arizona. We critically need to understand this immense digital vulnerability because it explains exactly why her specific house was targeted on that fateful night and how it paved the way for predatory opportunists to mercilessly exploit the grieving family later on in the investigation. The stark knowledge that she required highly specific daily medication adds a relentless ticking clock to this horrific scenario, amplifying the terror of her sudden disappearance. The heavy silence that fell over her quiet residence on the night of January 31st, 2026, was not the usual peaceful quiet of a serene desert evening. It was the deliberate and calculated construction of a chilling data gap, a void in the network signaling that something had gone terribly wrong. The first blaring alarm was raised on the morning of February 1st when the established routine was suddenly broken. Nancy faithfully logged in to attend her online church service every single week, but on this particular Sunday morning her screen remained entirely dark, that not a single ridge of a fingerprint or a stray skin cell would be left behind on any surface. Urgent calls to her landline and cell phone went completely unanswered, and this sudden, unexplained break in her strict daily pattern immediately terrified her daughters and extended family. The reality of her disappearance was quickly confirmed, prompting her family, including television anchor Nancy Guthrie, to issue desperate and tearful public pleas across national media broadcasts begging the public for any possible information regarding her unknown whereabouts. Local law enforcement rapidly descended upon the Catalina foothills home, locking down the sprawling perimeter to meticulously search for any physical clue that might explain the vanishing. What the crime scene investigators found, or rather what they entirely failed to find, was deeply disturbing and incredibly frustrating. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. The heavy exterior doors were completely intact and the fragile glass windows remained unbroken. Inside the immaculate home, there was no sign of a violent physical struggle. The furniture was not overturned, no items were smashed, and the typical chaotic markers of a forced home invasion were completely and bafflingly absent. The entire scene was clinically clean, suggesting the suspect either had a key or the victim willingly opened the door to her own abduction. This unknown suspect was a perfect ghost in the physical world, executing a plan designed to leave. The frustrated investigators were facing an impenetrable wall of silence, with no viable suspects, no physical direction, and a rapidly closing window of survivability. The entire missing persons investigation seemed entirely derailed and hopelessly stalled until a local television station suddenly received a highly unusual and terrifying message. A Tucson-based broadcast network known as KOLD Television opened a digital message containing a chilling and detailed ransom note. The specific demand within the message was incredibly modern and designed to evade traditional financial tracking, requiring a massive payout entirely in cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, accompanied by a strictly enforced countdown deadline. Simultaneously, direct and highly threatening text messages began rapidly hitting the personal cell phone of Nancy Guthrie, demanding an immediate financial payment in exchange for her elderly mother's safe return. This sudden and aggressive influx of digital communication violently shifted the entire foundation of the local police case. Law enforcement and federal agents now had to rapidly determine if they were dealing with a highly sophisticated ransom plot executed by a tactical criminal genius who had planned every variable, or if this was merely a deadly digital trap set by absolutely no DNA, no fibers, and no forensic clues for the crime scene technicians to discover. An opportunistic scammer who was watching the tragedy unfold on the national news. The sheer volume of digital noise and electronic demands threatened to completely drown out the actual ground investigation. Was the unseen person sending these aggressive Bitcoin demands the exact same physical phantom who walked silently through Nancy's front door? Hit the notification bell right now, because the next explosive phase of this investigation will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about this kidnapping case. Operating under extreme public pressure and the agonizing knowledge of the victim's medication needs, a heavily armed SWAT team launched a massive and chaotic midnight raid on February 13th. Tactical officers aggressively stormed a targeted property, focusing their intense operational power on two primary subjects named Luke Daly and his mother, Mary Daly. Investigators quickly executed comprehensive search warrants on their private residence and meticulously tore through the interior of their luxury Range Rover, desperately looking for any microscopic physical connection to the 84-year-old missing woman. The subsequent interrogations at the police precinct were highly intense, psychologically exhausting, and deeply probing, but they ultimately yielded absolutely nothing of value to the desperate detectives. But the target of this meticulous home invasion was Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman who, following grueling hours of relentless questioning regarding their whereabouts and activities, both Luke and Mary Daly were completely released from custody without facing any criminal charges related to the disappearance. Meanwhile, forensic video analysts were endlessly reviewing the extremely limited neighborhood security footage, which only managed to show a shadowy suspect wearing a dark mask and thick gloves. This figure remained completely unrecognizable, blending into the shadows and remaining completely untraceable through any traditional physical policing methods. The biggest and most promising investigative leads had just violently evaporated into thin air, leaving the task force essentially back at square one. Law enforcement was bleeding precious investigative time, chasing digital dead ends and literal shadows, while an extremely vulnerable 84-year-old woman remained missing in the elements without the life-sustaining medication she desperately needed. The sheer emotional terror inflicting the victim's relatives reached an absolute boiling point when federal agents finally tracked down the source of those vicious financial demands. On February 10th, the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a highly coordinated strike in Los Angeles, California, placing a man named Derek Colella under federal arrest. For a brief fleeting moment, there was a collective gasp of hope that the mastermind had been apprehended and that the elderly captive would be swiftly recovered. Relied heavily on essential daily medication to survive the harsh realities of her advanced age. But that desperate hope was instantly shattered by a much darker and deeply cynical reality. Colella was reportedly a former employee of Los Angeles County who had absolutely zero physical connection to the actual abduction taking place in the remote desert landscape of another state. He was not the sophisticated tactical phantom who bypassed the residential security systems. Instead, he was merely a ruthless digital scavenger. Operating from hundreds of miles away, this alleged extortionist had coldly watched the high-profile tragedy unfolding on national news networks and recognized an incredibly lucrative opportunity By exploiting the exact same publicly accessible databases that likely aided the original intruder, he easily acquired the private contact details of the grieving relatives. He systematically weaponized their agonizing vulnerability, sending those heartless messages to extract a payday from their unimaginable suffering. This stunning revelation plunged the official task force into a state of profound logistical chaos. The task force had dedicated an immense amount of finite manpower, sophisticated tracking resources, and crucial early days of the manhunt chasing a ghost who was merely capitalizing on the trauma. Every single passing second meant her life was slipping further and further into critical danger, as her body was deprived of the pharmaceutical support it desperately required. Colella represented a terrifying new breed of secondary victimization, a phenomenon where opportunistic predators swarm around a high-profile crisis, creating an impenetrable smokescreen of false leads. This devastating diversion meant the actual perpetrator had been granted an invaluable head start to solidify their escape and conceal their hostage. The frustrating realization that anyone with a laptop could so effortlessly mimic a kidnapper sent shockwaves through the community and fundamentally undermined the credibility of any incoming tips. Driven to absolute desperation by the agonizing lack of verifiable progress, the traumatized relatives took a drastic and monumental step. On February 24th, they publicly announced an unprecedented $1 million cash reward for any concrete information leading to a safe recovery. This massive financial incentive was a strategic gamble designed to break the loyalties of anyone who might be protecting the perpetrator. Yet this astronomical sum also carried a profound inherent risk of generating even more fraudulent noise from desperate individuals eager to claim the fortune. The investigators were now drowning in a chaotic sea of contradictory tips, fabricated sightings, and malicious hoaxes, while the true architect of this nightmare remained perfectly hidden. If a random former county worker could so effortlessly manipulate the flow of information, what terrifying capabilities did the real abductor possess? The authorities were essentially fighting a two-front war, battling both the actual criminal and the parasitic scammers feeding off the tragedy. The masked suspect had executed a flawless physical extraction from the residents, effectively erasing all traditional evidence that law enforcement usually relies upon to track a predator. Every single hour spent authenticating a worthless lead was an hour permanently lost for the captive. The chilling question, echoing through the command center, was whether the true culprit had deliberately anticipated this exact chaotic scenario. Did the Phantom intentionally leave a void, hoping that bottom-feeding scammers would rush in to muddy the waters and overwhelm the authorities? This complex web of deception left the detectives staring at a terrifyingly blank slate. The physical trail had been intentionally frozen, and the initial digital communications were proven to be a cruel hoax. The real monster was still out there, completely unbothered and entirely invisible. Law enforcement found themselves paralyzed by a terrifying paradox. The more famous the case became, the harder it was to find the truth hidden beneath layers of public obsession and greed. The entire investigative machine was spinning its wheels, burning through energy and hope, while the clock continued to run down. Families of missing persons often speak of the unbearable silence, but here the noise was actually weaponized against them. It was a suffocating barrage of deception designed to exhaust the resources of the state and break the spirit of the survivors.